about 15 and a half years ago, um, our son was born just as my mother was dying. And we kind of knew that was happening, but we weren't quite sure of the timing. But he was born in February, and then she passed away in early May. So she barely got to see him. We flew there with him when he was just tiny, and she held him once, but that was it. With having a new baby and having a new baby for the first time, there was the presence of this other thing, which was the knowledge that he would never get to know his grandmother, and that his grandmother would never get to know him, and and she would have wanted to, and there was something, or many things, that she would have wanted to give him, and she never would. So in the kind of maybe late night haze that one gets into, I would sit there and I would think, what can I do for my mom, for my son, as a way of of creating a thread. And I didn't know. And when you don't know, there's a kind of place you can go. And where I went was, I decided that I would read my son the Lotus Sutra from beginning to end. This one. There are many translations. This is a particularly nice one. And so in those moments, when my son couldn't sleep, when he was crying, when he was uncomfortable, I would hold him with one hand and rock him, and with the other hand I would read another few pages of the Lotus Sutra. And what I told myself and what I told him was that his grandmother was reading it for him. And so one of the first things he heard in this life would be this sutra that is held up by many as being the pinnacle of the Mahayana, the kind of the deepest expression of that path and those teachings. And we got through it. It took a long time. When we finished, it was, he didn't know what had happened. The book just went away. I don't know if my mother would have liked it. It's surely not what she would have chosen. But when I didn't know what to offer, I thought, well, I can offer this. And I tell this story because we've been reading this text by Dogen called Butsudo, it's the Way of the Buddhas, and he outlines 5 practices, and he's really speaking to lay people primarily. 5 practices that he says Buddhas take up, or that take you on the path of the Buddhas. And the 4th one, it's really short. He says, we should produce a Lotus Sutra during this life. We should write, copy, and retain it. We should always place it on our head and pay obeisance to it, offering it flowers, incense, lamps, food, and drink, and robes. We should always receive it in purity. So what he's saying is that we should take this text, one chapter of which we read frequently, the Universal Gateway, the whole thing, that we should copy it out by hand. We should keep that copy. We should place it on our heads. When we don't have it there, we should keep it on an altar. And on the altar, we should make offerings to it. We should offer flowers, incense, lamps, food, robes. And then he says we should always receive it in purity. And so whenever we take it down, we take it as something that we're receiving, again, to the head. Not as something we made, but as something that comes to us. And as I was thinking about this today, I had an instinct to spin this a little bit so that it makes more sense. And so for a while, I was thinking, I'm going to talk about immersing ourselves in the teachings in this kind of humble way. Because practicing writing out something like the Heart Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, it's so impersonal, right? It isn't us thinking about what we think about it. It isn't us writing a blog about the Lotus Sutra. It isn't us even having a study group about the Lotus Sutra where we try to pick it apart. It's just taking it as what it is. And I thought, well, I can speak to that idea of just being so open in that way. And I would like to give that talk, and it would be sincere. But in this case, I think it would miss the point, which is that what Dogen is talking about, and remember in the last one, he talked about producing a Buddha. He's talking about merit-making activities, which is so foreign here. It's so outside of the way that we usually talk about practice. We say sit, 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 and sometimes we expand that practice out into other kinds of ritual. But there's this other part that I think seems a little hard to penetrate. So I wanted to talk about that. Because sometimes we just feel that we need to offer something. In Dogen's time, to handwrite the Lotus Sutra was a tremendous offering. Right? There are only so many copies of this floating around, and it takes forever to make. So if you make one more, it's a big deal. Right? And then someone else gets to read that, and someone else can copy that. So in his time, there's an understanding that this has a kind of concrete value. Now, of course, you can buy it in this translation or in 10 other translations. And it can be hardcover, it can be softcover. You can buy it in English, you can buy it in Japanese. It's so easy, it's just pushing a button. And so that practical value is gone. And yet we retain this practice. I don't know anyone who has copied the Lotus Sutra. I've never met such a person. Probably because that person spends so much time alone copying the Lotus Sutra. But there is a very popular practice in Japan called shakyo. And shakyo means to write the sutras, to copy the sutras. And usually it's the Heart Sutra. And it's very formalized. It starts out, you'll be given a piece of paper where it's already written. And then you'll put paper over it so that you can see through to the bottom. And you follow each brush stroke. And you do the Heart Sutra. And so it's a certain number of characters per line. If 20 people are doing it, at the end they all kind of look the same, right? And then you do it again. And then you do it again. And you do it again. And eventually you memorize it, right? And then eventually maybe you don't do it exactly that way. But you're always putting the Heart Sutra out into the world. You're not changing it, right? You never edit it. You don't do just your favorite parts. You receive this as it is, and then you give it, and then you receive it again. People do this their whole lives. And like so many practices that are designated as lay practices in Japan, there can be a kind of attitude of condescension. Well, that's not zazen, right? That's not the practice. That's kind of having something to do. But that's a misunderstanding. It's a decision, it's a deeply humble decision to become very, very intimate with a teaching. Again, not so that you can analyze it, not so that you can write an essay about it, but so that you can absorb it, so that you can metabolize it, so that it becomes a part of who you are. So that at any minute you could recite it or you could write it. So that you could pull out a napkin and with a pen you could write out the Heart Sutra and you could give it to someone. And then they have the Heart Sutra. And it's the whole thing. There's an invitation in something like this to open ourselves up in a way that has nothing to do with us. To open ourselves up to something in such a way that we don't know what happens next. We don't know what it's like to walk around with the Lotus Sutra in our heads until we do it. What impact does that have? What does it change? What does it expose? There's only one way to find out. And that takes a leap that requires energy and time, and again, humility. It takes a willingness to make an offering without knowing how that offering is being received. To offer for its own sake. And it can be the Lotus Sutra, it can be the Heart Sutra, it can be something else. It can be sewing a robe. Each stitch exactly the way that you were taught. Each measurement exactly according to how it's always been done, with no hint of you in it. We all have to sit with something like this. Some of us may never take it up. For some of us, it may never resonate. But what I want to say is, it will almost certainly never resonate unless you try it. And if you try it, you might discover that there's something in this kind of practice, something in this kind of offering that surprises you and that has depth that you didn't expect. And with that, I'll stop.